Hey everyone, so today I want to talk about the 5.2 liter Voodoo V8 that was utilized in the GT350. Now, if you are an owner or potential owner of this car, you've probably read about all the fantastic characteristics, but the one thing that probably has you worried is the engine in this car regarding all of the engine replacements and engine failures that have happened throughout the year. So in this video, I want to talk about the different engines that were utilized in the GT350, some of the running changes that were done, as well as precautions that owners or potential owners could take that I think will significantly lower the likelihood of you having a problem with the engine in your GT350. Now, the 5.2 liter Voodoo V8 utilized in all 2015 to 2020 GT350s. There are considered two generations of the engine in this car. 2015 to 2018 is considered first generation. 2019 to 2020 is considered second generation. Now, on paper, these all make the same 526 horsepower and 429 pounds of torque, whether it's a Generation 1, Generation 2 engine, GT350 or GT350R. There have been some independent dyno tests that show some cars make more power than others, but it hasn't been consistent enough to show that a certain year or engine configuration makes more power. But a lot of people feel that Ford underrated the power numbers of this car from the factory because they definitely make a solid 526 horsepower. Now, if you want to tell whether or not your car has the original engine, that's actually pretty easy to do. You can do it without even having access to the car. I covered this in my engine decoding video. If you go behind the driver's front wheel, you can look at the number that is stamped into the engine block. On the rear bottom of every block is a 8-digit code. You really only need a flashlight to do this. If that code on the bottom of the engine block matches the last 8 characters of the VIN, you have the original engine in your car. If those numbers are different, the engine has been changed at some point in the car's lifespan. Now, for the first generation engines, there was a difference between GT350 and GT350R engines, and that was in the valve train. The 350Rs had different lash adjusters and cam phasers. That was basically to help the engine be more stable at very high engine speeds, since the 350Rs were oriented as a little bit more of a track car versus the 350 being a street car. It's not really that big of a deal. It's not that big of a change, but it is a small change with those engines. Now, if you want to see what engine your car has in it, that's also pretty easy to see, that I also covered in my engine decoding video. There's a sticker on the engine. To see this sticker, you have to remove the driver's side breather as well as the coil cover that covers the coils for the spark plugs. Between cylinders 7 and 8, there is a white sticker that will have a bunch of codes on it. You're specifically looking for the 3-digit engine code. For the Generation 1 engines, if you see code 557, that is a GT350 engine. If you see code 555, that is a GT350R engine. Usually in parentheses above that, it'll say GT350R. For the second generation engines, this also includes early cars that had engine changes on them. If you see the code KA555, that means you have a Gen 2 Voodoo engine. If you see two different characters than KA in front of 555, then you have a Gen 1 GT350R engine. And again, that sticker is between cylinders 7 and 8 on top of the engine between 2 of the coil packs. Now, there are 3 significant running changes that were done to this engine throughout that 15 to 20 production lifespan. The first change that came was they changed the oil filter type in 2017 from a spin-on to a cartridge-style filter. The main reason they did this was because there was the potential for the oil filter to loosen up and back out and cause an oil leak and or a fire, because the oil filter is right next to the exhaust manifold. Flat plane crank engines are known for having very extreme vibrations because the counterweights on a flat plane crank are set at 180 degrees on a 350 versus 90 degrees on a 5.0 or a GT500. Because of that, they vibrate a lot. And this is true with all flat plane crank engines. Even like Ferraris, they're known for having issues caused by the engine vibrations. Those extreme vibrations can cause the oil filter to start to back off over time. And it actually was caught on video. Someone at a track and they had their filter back off and it caused an engine fire and basically burned the car down, because now you have super hot oil spraying onto a red hot exhaust manifold and it causes a fire almost instantaneously. And it's very hard to stop at that point. So That was the main reason they changed it. So about 17 to 20 have a cartridge style filter where you remove the actual outer casing and replace the actual filter cartridge. There are some other cars, like my Corolla has a cartridge style filter on. There are other cars that utilize cartridge filters, but most vehicles, especially American vehicles, have typical spin-ons. So they changed that in 2017. The next change, they changed the pistons and the ring packs in 2018. This was most likely done to combat the oil consumption. There's actually very little information on the internet about this. Ford did this very quietly. If you really dig through some of the old records, you can find that they superseded the original piston and ring pack numbers with a set of new numbers for the later cars. Pistons and ring packs have a major play and characteristics on the level of oil consumption in an engine. And the early engines especially consumed a lot of oil, but they were designed to do that. These are production race engines. These are not built to the tolerances and specifications that your average car is going to be built to. So unfortunately, Ford and the dealers really didn't do a good job educating early owners on that. And if this car ate a quart of oil every 500 miles, that was considered normal. In any other car, it would not be. And some people were really not checking the oil enough to make sure that the oil level was high enough. So you would have people going thousands of miles, never checking the oil, and having low oil is one of the easiest ways to burn up an engine. So that was the main reason they changed the pistons and the ring pack, was to combat all the engine failures and replacements they were doing because of excessive oil consumption, which I'll talk a little bit about later in the video. And finally, the third and most significant running change they did for the GT350 was the Gen 2 Voodoo engine. 2019, they changed over to the Gen 2 engines. Ford changed a lot of parts. Everything from the block to a lot of the internals of the engine got changed. Some people say it's really not that significant, but if you actually look at the list of all the stuff that they changed, it was quite a few items that they changed to really beef up and improve the durability of the engine, to really help evolve the engine, make it stronger, make it better, and kind of get away from a lot of the engine failures that they had early on and a lot of people were basically complaining about. So those were really all three of the main running changes that the Voodoo engine got for its lifespan. Now, because of the changes done for the Gen 2 Voodoo, the Gen 1 tends to get a lot of hate because of that. Now, I think a lot of that hate is really overblown with it. Having a Gen 1 engine does not mean that it's going to burn oil. Having a Gen 2 engine does not mean it's going to blow up. There is no guarantee with these engines of do this, don't do that, and you will or will not have a failure on this engine. So there's a lot of owners out there with Gen 1s that report little to no oil consumption or they've had no problems with the car. Now, it is also worth noting that the Gen 1 engines were produced for a longer period of time. 15 wasn't a full production year, so I really don't count that, but 16 to 18 was. So basically, you had a 3-year production lifespan for the Gen 1s versus 2 years for the Gen 2. So not only are there more of them out there, but they've been out longer. They're older. They typically will have more mileage on them because they're an older engine. So if you start to really compound the data, it's obviously good. You're going to have more issue with Gen 1 just because they're older. They have more mileage on them. So it kind of skews the numbers. You kind of need to keep that in mind when you're reading a lot of the data about the engine failures on these, because this information has been collected and compounded over the years, and you kind of need to take that into account that they are an older engine. And there's kind of a myth out there that if you have a Gen 2, you're fine. You're not going to have any issues with oil consumption. You're not going to have an engine failure. That's not true. There have been issues with the Gen 2 engines. They are not perfect. They are not flawless. Gen 1 does not mean you're going to have an issue. Gen 2 does not mean you will not have an issue. There was unconfirmed reports of bad valves in some of the 19s. Not a lot of information on that. I don't know if that ended up being true, but that was kind of speculated. And there was the issue with the undeployed secondary cam tensioners. I did a video on that as well. Essentially, that was a flawed production. That wasn't really the engine's fault. I really can't blame the car for that because they just weren't building them right from the factory, and they were basically skipping time, and the pistons were hitting the valves. But that was an issue on the factory floor, not a design issue with the engine. So now, probably the most important thing I want to talk about is this is my opinion, the 3 main precautions that owners or potential owners can do to significantly lower the risk of you having an issue with your GT350 engine. By far, without question, the most important thing you need to do is check your oil. Again, I said it a little bit earlier in the video. This is a production race engine. This was designed to consume a lot of oil because this is built to a very different tolerances than your average street-driven car is designed to. And they really didn't educate owners on that early enough when these cars were new. So all the people that kind of don't check their oil enough or only really check it when they change the oil, if you're going thousands of miles and not checking the oil, there is a significant potential that you're going to burn up the engine, because a low oil condition is the easiest way to destroy an engine. This car takes 10 quarts of oil. If you're running 5 quarts because it's been burning oil, and you're running this thing to 8,000 RPMs, you're probably going to skim a bearing, you're going to overheat the engine, you're going to get some sort of metal-to-metal contact that will likely cause an engine failure. Because if you really dive into the information that's been compounded over the years and look at the multitude of engine failures, because there's really not one specific thing that does or does not cause a failure, most, and I will even say the overwhelming majority, have the plausibility of being related to low oil conditions, scored cylinder walls, snap connecting rods, spun bearings, things like that that are related to a low oil condition. Most of them will be related to that. And that comes down to, did you check your oil? Did you have the proper amount of oil to properly lubricate and protect the engine? And a lot of times people didn't do that. It's not always that condition, but it is, I would say more often than not, it is related to that. So without a question, if you own or will own one of these cars, you need to check your oil a lot. Ford recommends every time you fuel the car to check it, because Ford's limit was a quart every 500 miles or less than a quart every 500 miles. That was acceptable. If that was the case, you were not getting an engine replacement. If your car ate a quart of oil every 500 miles or ate a quart in less than 500, typically you were getting an engine replacement. I also did a video on all the recalls of this car. Contrary to popular belief, Ford never issued TSBs or recalls regarding engine failure or oil consumption. They didn't do it. I scoured the internet. I've talked to people. It didn't happen. A lot of people have asked me about that, but they did do that oil program where they would see how much oil it was eating, and if it was a lot, they would replace it. But again, every time you fuel up the car, especially if the car is new to you, establish a pattern. When I got this car, I was checking the oil every 100 miles to see where it was. Until I establish a pattern that this car burns virtually no oil, I don't really go long enough between oil changes to say exactly how much, if any, it really burns. But once I started seeing it was burning no oil at 100-mile intervals, I was kind of spacing out a little bit more. And this car burns virtually no oil because I've established that pattern to see where the oil consumption is. That's the most important thing you need to do. Establish your pattern so you don't burn up the engine. I don't know if they're still doing those oil programs on these. It's been a number of years, but just keep that in mind. This has the acceptable limit is a quart every 500 miles. That's a lot more than any other modern production car is going to have. Up next, warming up the car. 2 parts to this. There are 2 main reasons you need to warm up the car before you really dive into the RPMs. Number 1, the thermal expansion for the forged pistons on these cars. Most cars have cast pistons. It's casted in a mold and they machine it, throw it in a car, that's it. Performance cars, especially like this one, have forged pistons. They take a piece of metal, and there's different ways to do it, but they squeeze that metal really tight. And essentially the metal becomes denser. It's much thicker, it's much stronger than a cast piston is going to be. The byproduct of that is they need to allow more room for thermal expansion. When things get hot, metal gets hot, it expands a little bit. So they have to make the piston a little bit smaller than a cast piston, because as the piston gets hot, it's going to expand a little bit to fill that cylinder wall out. Versus a cast piston, they don't really have to do that because there's not as much metal there. The issue you run into is the early cars especially have something called piston slap. Ford issued an SSM, special service message about that for the early cars, because some people were thinking, oh, is this a problem? Is it rod knock? Is it something else? This is common with almost all cars that has forged pistons and short skirts. Even the LS engines had issues with this for a while. So what they do is they make the piston a little bit smaller, so when it expands, it properly fills the cylinder. So when the engine is cold, instead of the piston going perfectly up and down, it's going to bounce. This is exaggerated so you can see it, but it's going to basically bounce back and forth on the cylinder wall as it's going up and down until it expands. Once that piston gets a little bit bigger to fill the cylinder bore, it's going to go perfectly up and down the way it should. What this means is keep your foot out of it when the car is cold, because it's okay at low, it might sound really bad, but that's okay at low engine speed, having that little bit of piston slap. Like I said, it's normal with cars with forged pistons, but again, keep your foot out of it and wait till it warms up before you dive into the RPM, because that piston's not supposed to bounce back and forth. And you might hear a little bit, especially on the early Gen 1 engines. Ford was aware of it. They were not taking any action. SSMs are basically notes to owners for the dealers to provide regarding that. And the other part of that is the engine oil for this car. Not only do you want to make sure that you're running a oil that meets Ford specifications, because there are engine oils out there for this car that are the proper 550 weight, but they don't meet the Ford specifications. But this car has a very thick oil. Most modern cars like Ford's 020 engine oil, 520, a thin oil that's good for flow characteristics in all weather conditions, whether it's really cold outside. It's going to give good engine flow at cold temperatures. The problem is they are not really good for very high engine speeds. This car, the 350s, the 500s, 5W50, a very thick engine oil that's designed to survive brutal conditions. Very high engine RPMs, very high temperatures. 5W50 does not break down the way like a 5W20 in a 5.0 will. A 550 will survive for much longer than a thinner oil will. The problem with that is you have very high engine oil pressures in this car, especially when it's cold. You could have this car parked outside on a 100-degree day. If the engine's stone cold and you fire this thing up, you're going to get 115, 125 pounds of oil pressure. Enormous oil pressure on a stone cold car at idle speed that's not under load. On a regular car, you're probably going to see, in the same conditions, you probably see 50, 60 pounds. So you're probably going to get about double the oil pressure in this car. That's a lot of stress on the engine. That's a lot of stress on the oil pump gear. And you're not getting the proper flow characteristics at high RPMs that you're going to get at low RPMs. When the car is cold, you can still drive it just like the Pistons. Keep the revs down. I think Ford recommends about 3,000 RPM max till it gets up to about 180 degrees or so. Keep your foot out of it, because if you run this thing to 8,000 RPM when the oil's cold and it's really thick, it's not going to be able to get into the different galleys and lubricate all the different parts of the engine properly the way it will when it's fully warmed up. Keep your foot out of it so you don't run the risk of skimming a bearing or causing some direct metal-to-metal contact because the oil can't move fast enough. When the oil's fully warmed up, versus you, when it's cold, sitting, watching that oil pressure gauge sit at 115, 120 pounds of pressure. When the engine's at full operating temperature, that's going to be like 35 to 40 pounds. So there is an enormous swing in oil pressure in this car. So keep your foot out of it if you don't want the potential to run into an issue with this car. Number 3, this is also 2 parts. This is regarding the oil filter. Number 1, you want to make sure you utilize the proper torque on the oil filter to keep it from backing off during engine operating conditions, because the engine vibrations. This is especially important for Generation 1 engines. Ford did issue an owner's kit for the Gen 1 cars that came with an owner supplement explaining the importance of torquing the oil filter correctly, not just putting it on saying, oh, that's good enough. Came with the owner supplement explaining it, came with a oil filter adapter, an extra oil filter, basically all that stuff you need to properly torque it. Because if you don't, it can back off. It could also happen with the later cartridge cars. It really wasn't an issue with those backing up, but you want to make sure, get that torque wrench out, properly torque the oil filter on this car. Don't mess around with that, because if you don't, and that oil filter backs off when you're running the car, you definitely could have a fire. It's happened before, it can happen again. So properly torque it. Even some of the owners with the early Gen 1s with the spin-on filter, they will typically take a hose clamp and they will, after it's properly torqued, put the hose clamp on the filter and wedge the head of the hose clamp up against the oil filter housing. So even if it does start to back off, that hose clamp will prevent it from backing off anymore. So that was another precaution that's pretty simple that a lot of owners with spin-on filters take. And finally, part 2 of utilizing the correct filter is to utilize the correct filter that is specific for your engine. For the spin-on, the early cars, they used the Motorcraft 2069 filter, the spin-on filter. There's really been no issues with using the proper filter with that car. The real issue comes with the later cars, the later Gen 1s and the Gen 2s with the cartridge style filter. With that cartridge filter, Ford originally was speccing utilizing Motorcraft's Ford's 2062 cartridge filter. This is the same filter that's used on like F-150s with the 2.7 and a bunch of other Ford vehicles. The problem is, not only is it not as good of a filter media because it is a cellulose media, it has a plastic cage on the inside. And some owners have shown that whether this is from the extreme oil pressures of the Voodoo engine or it being over-torqued, that plastic cage that holds the filter together can break, it can crack, and those plastic pieces can get sucked up into the engine. You don't want to run that filter on these Shelbys, whether you're talking about 350s or even 500s. Ford specifically designed the Motorcraft 2087 for the Shelbys. Not only is it a better filter media, it is a synthetic media that has better filtration characteristics. More importantly, it has a steel core inside of it. So even if it hit with very extreme oil pressures. It's a little over torqued. It will not break and come apart the way the plastic cage on the 2062 will. So keep that in mind. Run the proper filter so you don't accidentally have the filter come apart and have little pieces of plastic cage get sucked up into the oil, into the engine, because it's already past the pickup tube at that point, and it could potentially go inside the block and get pushed around different parts of the engine, block oil flow. A lot of bad things that happen. Just use, if you have a cartridge car, use a 2087. It's a better filter overall, and it's not that much more expensive. So, like I said, this has been a pretty long video, but there's a lot of differences in these engines. And these three main precautions I went over, I think will significantly lower your likelihood to have a problem. Again, there is no one-stop shop, do this or don't do this with a Gen 1 or a Gen 2. You will not have a problem. It doesn't exist. There's been so much of a multitude of issues from problems, but these three precautions, I think, cover all the big stuff and will significantly lower your likelihood. I don't think you should necessarily be scared away from a Gen 1 engine. Gen 2 engines, cars typically have, the 19s and the 20s are a much more expensive car. They tend to pull a significant premium value-wise, which means some of the early cars you can actually get for a pretty good value. Even the 350R, some of the early ones, you can get them for a pretty good price because a lot of people are scared off of the Gen 1 engines. I don't think you necessarily should be, but you really want to take your precautions, maintain the car properly, make sure you especially stay on top of your oil consumption. If you're able to speak with the original owner, see kind of what the oil consumption rate is for the car, and then investigate the engine itself and see is it original to the car and what generation engine it is. So I hope that you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.